Have you ever had one of those moments where reality seemed to answer you back? Not in a dramatic way, but subtly. You think about someone, and they call. You wake up with a certain mood, and the whole day seems to follow that tone. It's easy to dismiss these moments as coincidence, but they leave a quiet question behind. What if your mind isn't just reacting to life, but tuning into it? Not creating reality out of nothing, not controlling the world, but adjusting how reality meets you. Like an antenna, always receiving, always transmitting, even when you're not aware of it. If that's true, then most of what you experience isn't random. It's a response. And the real question isn't whether this is happening, it's whether you're doing it consciously or on autopilot. When scientists first noticed that observations seemed to interfere with experiments, the reaction wasn't excitement, it was discomfort. Something about the finding didn't fit the clean, mechanical picture of reality they were trying to build. In the early days of quantum physics, researchers discovered that particles didn't behave the same way when they were being measured as when they were not. The very act of looking changed the result. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, measurably. This wasn't a small detail. It shook the foundation of how reality was supposed to work. For centuries, science operated under a simple assumption. The world exists out there, complete and independent, and the observer stands apart from it. You look. Reality performs. End of story. But the observer principle cracked that story open. It suggested something far more unsettling, that reality at its most basic level does not fully take shape until it is observed. At first, many scientists tried to minimize this. They treated it as a technical glitch, a problem with instruments, a limitation of measurement, anything but what it was quietly pointing to, that the observer is part of the system, not outside of it. This idea was so disruptive that even today it is often softened, wrapped in technical language, or kept inside the laboratory. You'll hear phrases like measurement interaction or wave function collapse, which sound abstract enough to keep the implications safely contained. But behind the math is a simple, uncomfortable truth. Observation matters. Not intention, not belief. Observation. Before a particle is measured, it exists in a range of possibilities, not one outcome but many. When it is observed, those possibilities narrow into a single expression. Something becomes definite, real in a specific way. And the timing of that change is what startled everyone. It doesn't happen when the particle decides. It happens when the observation occurs. Now, here's where science became cautious. Because if observation affects reality at the smallest scale, the question becomes unavoidable. What role does the observer play in the larger picture? And more importantly, where does that role end? Rather than explore that openly, mainstream discussion drew a boundary. The observer principle was declared relevant only to subatomic particles, not to daily life. As if reality politely switches rules when you step out of the lab. As if the universe says, down here, observation matters. Up there it doesn't. But that boundary was never proven. It was assumed. And assumptions are often where the most important truths are hidden. When you observe anything, an event, a person, a situation, you are not a neutral camera. Your nervous system is involved, your expectations are involved, your past experiences are involved. Attention is never empty. It always carries structure, and that structure influences what information is amplified, what is filtered out, and what pattern becomes dominant. This is not mysticism, it's how perception works. Two people can witness the same event and walk away with two different realities, not opinions, lived realities. Their bodies respond differently. Their memories encode differently. Their next decisions shift accordingly. Observation didn't just record the moment. It shaped the trajectory that followed. Science knows this, but often treats it as a psychological side note rather than a foundational principle. Yet when you trace cause and effect carefully, you begin to see that observation is the first link in the chain. What you notice determines what matters. What matters determines what you respond to. And what you repeatedly respond to becomes the structure of your life. So, why was this discovery so carefully contained? Because it threatens the idea of separation. If observation influences outcomes, then the observer cannot be fully separate from what is observed. And if that's true, then the story of a detached mind living inside a meaningless mechanical universe begins to fall apart. Responsibility shifts, power shifts. The individual is no longer just a passenger. This is where science hesitated, not because the data was wrong, but because the implications were too big. It's much easier to believe that reality happens to you than to accept that your mode of attention is always shaping how reality unfolds. That doesn't mean you control everything. It means you participate in more than you were taught to notice. And participation is unsettling because it removes the comfort of distance. When observation is unconscious, it still works. It just works blindly. Patterns repeat, reactions loop, outcomes feel inevitable. But nothing about that inevitability is neutral. It is the result of unattended observation running the show. This is why the observer principle matters far beyond physics. It hints that awareness itself is an active ingredient, not a passive witness. And once you see that, it becomes harder to maintain the belief that your mind is sealed off from the world, locked behind your eyes, separate and powerless. That belief, the belief in separation, is the next illusion that needs to be examined. Because if the observer is always involved, then the idea that the mind stands apart from reality starts to look less like truth and more like a very useful story we were taught to keep everything else intact. From the moment you learned to speak, you were quietly trained to divide reality in two. There was you and there was everything else. Your thoughts were private, invisible, locked inside your head. The world, on the other hand, was solid, external, and indifferent. This separation felt obvious, natural, almost undeniable. But what feels obvious is often the most conditioned idea of all. The belief that the mind is separate from the world is not something you discovered on your own. It was inherited, passed down through language, education, and culture. Every time you were told to be realistic, the message was subtle but clear. Reality is out there, fixed and unmoved by what happens inside you. Your inner life was framed as commentary, not causation. Yet when you look closely at your own experience, this clean division starts to blur. Think about how your body reacts to a thought. A single memory can tighten your chest, change your breathing, or flood you with warmth. Nothing in the external world has changed, yet your internal state alters your physical reality in seconds. If the mind were truly separate, this wouldn't happen. Thought would remain abstract, harmless, disconnected. But it doesn't. It moves chemistry. It shifts posture. It alters perception. And perception is not a window, it is a filter. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as your nervous system interprets it in real time. Colors, sounds, meanings. None of these arrive untouched. They are assembled. The mind doesn't just receive reality, it participates in constructing it. The world you experience is already shaped by attention, memory, expectation, and emotional tone before you ever form an opinion about it. Still, we cling to the idea of separation because it offers comfort. If the mind is separate, then we are not responsible for much. Events simply happen. People are just the way they are. Patterns repeat because that's life. Separation turns us into bystanders, and being a bystander feels safer than being involved. But safety comes at a cost. When you believe your mind is isolated from the world, you stop noticing how deeply connected you already are. You overlook the feedback loops that quietly guide your life. Your focus narrows, your curiosity dulls. You begin to live as if your inner state is a reaction to the world, rather than part of the process that shapes how the world shows up for you. This illusion also creates a strange contradiction. On one hand, we say thoughts don't matter. On the other, we spend our lives trying to change how we think, how we feel, how we see ourselves. If the mind were truly separate, why would its condition matter so much? Why would stress age the body? Why would hope improve recovery? Why would chronic fear slowly shrink the world you're willing to move through? The truth is, separation was never proven. It was assumed because it made reality easier to manage, explain, and control. A divided world is simpler to map. But simple maps leave out critical terrain. Even modern science, despite its caution, keeps bumping into this. Placebo effects, psychosomatic symptoms, perceptual bias. These are treated as exceptions, but they all point to the same thing. The boundary between mind and world is porous. Influence flows both ways. Ancient traditions spoke of this without hesitation. They didn't describe the mind as something trapped inside the skull. They described it as a field, an activity, a movement within a larger whole. Not mystical in the fantasy sense, but practical, observable. If you changed your inner orientation, your outer experience shifted. Not magically, but gradually through countless small adjustments in perception and response. What changed over time was not reality itself, but the story we told about it. The story of separation made us efficient, but it also made us numb. It taught us to ignore subtle signals, to dismiss intuition, to distrust quiet awareness in favor of constant analysis. We learned to value thinking over observing, explaining over noticing. And that's where the next problem emerges. If the mind is not separate, then it is always in relationship with what it perceives, which means that even when you're not paying attention, something is still being tuned. Patterns are still being reinforced, assumptions are still shaping what stands out and what fades into the background. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous, not because it's false, but because it keeps you unaware of your participation. You may believe you're simply reacting to life, when in fact your habitual ways of seeing are quietly organizing it. Your expectations influence what you notice. What you notice influences what you engage with. What you engage with becomes your evidence for how reality works. Once this loop begins to run automatically, the sense of separation hardens. The world feels fixed, predictable, limited. And without realizing it, you begin to live on mental autopilot, guided less by conscious choice and more by unattended patterns of thought that have been repeating for years. Most of your thinking does not happen the way you imagine it does. It doesn't arrive as a clear sentence you consciously choose. It moves faster than words. It shows up as a feeling, a reaction, a quiet assumption that feels so normal you don't question it. And because it feels normal, you trust it. This is the trap of automatic thinking. Automatic thinking is efficient. It helps you cross the street without analyzing every step. It allows you to recognize faces, drive familiar roads, and respond quickly to danger. But the same system that protects you also runs much of your life without asking for permission, and once it takes over, it rarely announces itself. You don't wake up in the morning and decide how to feel about the day. A mood is already there. A tone has been set. Before you speak to anyone, before anything happens, your mind has already interpreted the world. That interpretation then becomes the lens through which everything else is filtered. What makes this so powerful is that automatic thoughts don't feel like thoughts, they feel like reality. If you think, this always goes wrong, it doesn't register as an opinion, it registers as a fact. Your body tightens. Your attention scans for confirmation. You notice every small problem and overlook anything that contradicts the story. By the end of the day, the thought feels proven, not because it was true, but because it was active. This is how unconscious thinking tunes your experience without you ever intending it to. The mind is constantly predicting. It guesses what will happen next based on past patterns. That's how it conserves energy. But predictions are not neutral. They lean toward what is familiar, not what is accurate. And familiarity often comes from repetition, not truth. If you've repeated a certain interpretation for years, it becomes the default. The mind stops questioning it. It runs automatically, like background software. And because you're not aware of it, you assume you are seeing clearly. This is where the sense of powerlessness begins. Life feels like something that happens to you. Situations seem to just turn out a certain way. People appear consistently disappointing or unpredictable or unsafe. You rarely stop to ask how much of that experience is being shaped by what your attention is already prepared to find. Automatic thinking thrives on speed. It hates pauses. The moment you slow down enough to notice it, it loses some of its control. That's why it keeps you busy, distracted, reactive, always responding, rarely observing, and the more reactive you become, the more convincing your inner narrative feels. You might believe you're responding to the world as it is, but in many moments, you're responding to a mental shortcut, a compressed version of reality that leaves out nuance, possibility, and choice. Over time, these shortcuts harden into beliefs. Beliefs about yourself, beliefs about others, beliefs about what is possible. None of this requires conscious agreement. It happens quietly, through repetition. This is why two people can face the same situation and live completely different experiences. One sees an obstacle, the other sees information. One tightens, the other adjusts. The difference is not intelligence or optimism. It's what their automatic thinking is tuned to notice first. And here's the uncomfortable part. Automatic thinking doesn't care whether it helps you or not. It cares about efficiency and consistency. If a fearful interpretation once kept you safe, it will keep using it long after it stops being useful. If a self-critical voice once motivated you, it will keep speaking even when it begins to shrink your world. This is not because the mind is cruel. It's because it is habitual. Once a pattern is established, the mind prefers to repeat it rather than revise it. Revision takes energy, awareness takes effort, habit runs on its own. The trap is believing that because a thought appears automatically, it must be true. Or worse, that it must be you. But thoughts are events, not identities. They arise, perform their function, and fade, if they are allowed to. When they are not observed, they loop. When they are not questioned, they become the atmosphere you live in. Over time, this atmosphere begins to influence how reality responds to you. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Your posture changes. Your tone shifts. Your choices narrow. People respond differently. Opportunities feel closer or further away. The world you experience subtly reorganizes itself around your unattended assumptions. And when those assumptions are driven by fear, tension, or constant expectation of failure, the feedback you receive often reflects that state back to you. This is where many people begin to feel that reality itself is hostile or chaotic. They don't see the role of automatic thinking in shaping that experience. They only feel the result. And yet, the moment you start to notice the quality of your observation, the emotional charge behind it, the speed of your conclusions, you begin to sense something important. It's not just what you think that matters, but how you observe while you're thinking. Because the state from which you observe carries energy. And when that state is fear-based, reality seems to answer in kind. Fear changes the way you look at the world long before it changes what actually happens. It narrows your attention. It speeds up your conclusions. It makes everything feel urgent, unstable, slightly out of control. And once fear becomes the lens through which you observe, reality begins to feel chaotic, not because it suddenly is, but because you are no longer seeing the whole picture. When you are afraid, your mind stops exploring and starts scanning. It looks for threats, problems, signs that something is about to go wrong. This is not a flaw, it is a survival mechanism. But survival mode was never designed to run your entire life. It was designed for short moments of danger, not for daily observation. Yet many people live there without realizing it. You wake up tense. Your body already expects resistance from the day. Before anything has actually happened, your nervous system is prepared for conflict, disappointment, or loss. From that state, every neutral event becomes suspicious. A delay feels like rejection. A silence feels like danger. A small mistake feels like proof that things are falling apart. Fear doesn't invent events. It reorganizes meaning. This is why days that start with anxiety often seem to spiral. One thing goes slightly wrong and suddenly everything feels off. Conversations feel sharp. Decisions feel rushed. You miss details you would normally catch. You react instead of respond. And by the end of the day, it feels as if the world itself was working against you. But if you look closely, the pattern is not external. It's internal. When fear drives observation, your behavior changes in subtle ways. Your tone tightens. Your posture closes. Your choices become defensive. People respond to that even if they can't name it. Situations escalate faster because there is no spaciousness in your attention. Everything is handled with urgency, and urgency amplifies friction. This creates a feedback loop. Fearful observation leads to constrained perception. Constrained perception leads to limited options. Limited options increase stress. Increased stress reinforces fear. At no point does the loop require a dramatic external cause. It runs on interpretation. From the inside, it feels like chaos. From the outside, it looks like a system under pressure. This is often misunderstood as attracting bad things, but that language misses the point. Reality is not punishing you. It is responding to the state from which you are engaging with it, not morally, mechanically. Systems respond to input. When the input is tension, the output tends to be noise. Think about how you handle a delicate task when you're calm versus when you're afraid of messing up. Your hands are steadier when you're relaxed. When fear enters, movements become jerky. Precision drops, errors multiply. The task didn't change, the observer did. The same principle applies to life as a whole. Fearful observation also collapses time. The future rushes into the present. You begin to live in anticipation rather than awareness. Instead of meeting what is happening now, you react to what you think might happen next. This makes reality feel unstable, as if it's constantly slipping out of your control. In that state, even good moments are fragile. You can't fully inhabit them because part of your attention is already bracing for loss. Joy becomes something to protect instead of something to experience. And protection, when driven by fear, often suffocates what it tries to preserve. What's important to understand is that fear does not just color your emotions. It shapes your observation. And observation, as you've seen, is not passive. It influences what patterns become dominant in your experience. This is why chronic fear makes the world feel harsher over time. Not because danger increases, but because your tolerance for uncertainty decreases. Ambiguity becomes threatening. Complexity feels overwhelming. The unknown turns into an enemy. Reality, which is naturally complex and uncertain, begins to feel chaotic simply because it no longer fits inside the narrow frame fear allows. And yet fear often feels justified. It points to evidence. It shows you examples of things that went wrong before. It speaks with urgency and conviction. That's what makes it so convincing. Fear doesn't whisper, it insists. But insistence is not accuracy. The moment you begin to observe fear itself, not as an enemy, but as a state, you create a small gap. In that gap, the intensity softens, your breathing changes, your field of attention widens. You start to notice more than just threats. Options reappear. This shift doesn't eliminate challenges. It changes how they are metabolized. From a steadier state, reality feels less chaotic even when it's demanding. You see sequences instead of explosions. You respond in steps instead of reactions. The same world, observed differently, reveals a different texture. And this leads to a quiet but crucial distinction. Looking at something is not the same as observing it. Fear makes you look. It does not let you observe. It pulls you towards surfaces and away from depth. To observe requires a different inner posture, one that allows space, curiosity, and presence. And without realizing it, most people have forgotten how to do that, mistaking constant vigilance for awareness. Most people believe they are observing when they are actually just looking. The two feel similar on the surface, but they come from very different inner states. Looking is fast, automatic. It skims the surface of things and moves on. Observing is slower. It has weight. It involves presence, not just sight. You can look at something and miss almost everything that matters. Looking is what happens when the mind is already busy. It checks for what it expects to see and confirms it. A familiar face becomes a label. A situation becomes a category. A moment becomes a continuation of a story you already know. There is no discovery in looking, only recognition. Observing, on the other hand, begins when recognition pauses. When you truly observe, you are not trying to confirm anything. You are not scanning for danger or proof. You are allowing information to arrive without immediately deciding what it means. This requires a different kind of attention, one that is relaxed but alert, open but grounded. That state is rare not because it is difficult, but because it feels unproductive. It doesn't rush, it doesn't judge. And in a culture that values speed and certainty, observation can feel almost uncomfortable. Looking keeps you in control. Observing asks you to participate. When you look at a person, you see what you already believe about them, their role in your life, your history together, your expectations. All of that appears instantly, without effort. Observation softens those edges. It allows you to notice tone, timing, small shifts in expression. You begin to sense what is happening now, not what usually happens. This difference matters because reality unfolds in the present, not in your expectations. Looking is driven by memory. Observing is grounded in presence. Memory is efficient, but it is outdated by definition. It tells you what was, not what is. When memory dominates perception, the world feels repetitive. People feel predictable. Situations feel stuck. Observation interrupts that loop. It brings you into direct contact with what is actually unfolding, which is always slightly different from what you assume. Even familiar situations contain variation, but you only notice that variation when you slow down enough to let it register. Fear pushes you toward looking. It wants quick answers. It wants certainty. Observation requires tolerance for not knowing, and fear resists that. This is why, under stress, people stop observing and start reacting. They see less, not more. True observation widens your field of awareness. You notice not only what is happening, but how you are responding to it, your breath, your posture, the emotional tone behind your thoughts. This self-awareness is not self-absorption, it is orientation. When you are oriented, you can move with precision. Looking tends to fragment experience. You focus on one thing at a time, often the loudest or most threatening. Observation integrates. It allows multiple layers to exist at once. You can notice a challenge without becoming consumed by it. You can feel emotion without losing clarity. This integrated attention is what gives observation its influence. When you observe fully, you are not feeding unconscious patterns. You are not amplifying fear or habit. You are simply present. And presence has a stabilizing effect on both the observer and what is being observed. This is why observation changes outcomes. Not because it forces reality to behave differently, but because it changes the quality of interaction. When you observe rather than look, your responses become more measured. Your timing improves. You listen more accurately. You speak more precisely. The system you are part of begins to regulate itself. From the outside, it may look like calm or wisdom. From the inside, it feels like space. Looking keeps you on the surface of life. Observing takes you into relationship with it. And relationship is where influence lives. Most people don't realize how rarely they observe. They assume attention is on or off, when in fact it has texture, depth, direction. The quality of your attention shapes what you experience long before you decide how you feel about it. This is why simply trying to think positively rarely works. Thinking happens on top of observation. If observation is rushed, tense, or narrow, new thoughts are quickly pulled back into old patterns. Without a shift in how you observe, effort stays superficial. When observation deepens, effort decreases. You stop fighting reality and start reading it. You sense when to act and when to wait. You feel when something is aligned and when it's forced. This sensitivity doesn't come from analysis. It comes from contact. And contact requires tuning. Just as a radio must be adjusted to receive a clear signal, your attention has to be calibrated. If it's too tight, everything sounds distorted. If it's too loose, nothing stands out. Observation is the act of fine-tuning your inner receiver. Most people don't realize they are constantly adjusting the dial, often in the wrong direction, chasing clarity while increasing noise. And until that tuning becomes conscious, the signals they receive from reality remain scrambled. If you think of the mind as a radio instead of a factory, many things begin to make more sense. A radio doesn't create music. It doesn't argue with the signal. It receives, filters, and translates what is already present into something you can hear. When the tuning is off, the sound becomes distorted. When the tuning is precise, the signal comes through clearly. Your mind works in a similar way. At every moment, reality offers far more information than you can consciously process. Sounds, signals, cues, possibilities, meanings. You don't receive all of it. You receive what you are tuned to. Attention is the dial. Expectation is the preset. Emotional state determines whether the signal arrives clean or filled with static. Most people don't realize they are constantly tuning their minds. They assume the station they're on is simply what's happening, but what's happening and what you're receiving are not always the same thing. When you're anxious, the dial turns toward threat. When you're resentful, it leans toward injustice. When you're curious, it opens to nuance. The external world may not change at all, yet the experience of it shifts dramatically. This is not imagination, it is selection. Just like a radio in a noisy room, the mind has to filter. It amplifies some frequencies and suppresses others. That filtering happens automatically unless it's made conscious, and once it's automatic, you stop noticing that tuning is even occurring. This is why people can live in the same city, work in similar jobs, and yet describe entirely different realities. One experiences constant pressure and hostility. Another experiences challenge and growth. The difference is not the environment, it's the frequency being received. The mistake many people make is trying to change reality by fighting the signal they don't like. They argue with what they hear, they judge it, they wish it would stop. But a radio doesn't improve reception by criticizing the noise. It improves reception by adjusting the dial. The same is true for the mind. When something feels off in your life, the instinct is to push harder, think louder, control more. But effort without tuning often increases distortion. The mind becomes tense, attention narrows, static increases. You end up reinforcing the very signal you're trying to escape. Fine-tuning is quieter than force. It begins with noticing the quality of your attention, not the content of your thoughts, but the tone beneath them. Is your attention tight or open? Rushed or steady? Defensive or curious? These qualities determine what information you're able to receive. When the mind is tight, it filters aggressively. Only what fits the existing story gets through. When the mind is open, new signals are allowed in. Possibilities that were previously invisible become noticeable. Timing improves. Intuition sharpens. You don't become psychic, you become receptive. This receptivity is often misunderstood as passivity, but it's the opposite. A well-tuned radio is responsive. It picks up subtle changes. It adjusts quickly. It doesn't get stuck broadcasting the same noise over and over again. The mind, when well-tuned, becomes adaptable. This doesn't mean you accept everything without discernment. A radio still chooses a station, but the choice is deliberate, not habitual. You are no longer trapped listening to whatever signal happens to be loudest in the moment. Many people unknowingly stay tuned to the same frequencies for years: worry, self-criticism, comparison. These stations feel familiar, even if they are exhausting. Changing them feels strange at first, not because the new signal is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. Familiarity is not the same as truth. When you begin to fine-tune your attention, you may notice moments of clarity followed by old noise returning. This is normal. Dials drift. Habits pull you back. Fine-tuning is not a one-time adjustment. It's an ongoing relationship with attention. And the more conscious that relationship becomes, the less power unconscious programming has over you. What's important to understand is that tuning does not create reality out of nothing. It determines which aspects of reality become dominant in your experience. Just as a radio doesn't create the broadcast, your mind doesn't invent the world, but it decides which parts of it you live inside. This is where science and lived experience quietly meet. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce perception. The loop is not mystical, it's observable. And yet, long before modern science, spiritual traditions spoke of attention as a force, not because it bends the universe to your will, but because it stabilizes coherence. When attention is scattered, experience fragments. When attention is coherent, life feels aligned. Most people don't suffer because reality is harsh. They suffer because their inner signal is noisy. And much of that noise doesn't come from within. It comes from constant exposure to other people's signals, opinions, fears, narratives, and interpretations that enter through attention and quietly reset the dial without permission. For a long time, science and spirituality were treated as opposites. One was framed as rational and reliable, the other as symbolic, subjective, even naive. But that division is slowly dissolving. Not because spirituality became more scientific, but because science became more honest about what it was actually observing. Long before laboratories and equations, ancient traditions paid close attention to the effects of attention itself. They noticed that what you repeatedly focus on grows stronger in your experience, not as a belief, but as a pattern. Anger fed more anger. Gratitude softened perception. Stillness clarified decisions. These observations weren't mystical claims. They were practical insights drawn from lived experience over generations. At the time, there was no language of neurons or feedback loops. So the insights were framed as stories, metaphors, and teachings. Where attention goes, energy flows. Today, that phrase may sound vague, but when translated into modern terms, it becomes surprisingly precise. Neural pathways strengthen with repeated focus. Perception biases reinforce behavior. Attention trains the brain. Science didn't disprove ancient wisdom. It explained the mechanism. Modern research shows that the brain is not a fixed structure. It rewires itself based on use. What you attend to regularly becomes easier to notice, faster to interpret, harder to ignore. This is not philosophy. It is neuroplasticity. Attention leaves physical traces in the nervous system. At the same time, physics discovered something equally unsettling. At the most fundamental level, reality is not a set of solid objects behaving independently. It is a field of probabilities. Observation collapses those probabilities into specific outcomes. Again, the language is technical, but the implication is simple. Attention matters. Spiritual traditions never needed to measure particles to know this. They observed it inwardly. They noticed that the quality of awareness changed the quality of experience. A distracted mind suffered more. A disciplined mind perceived more clearly. A fearful mind lived in a harsher world. Science arrived at the same conclusion from the outside in. What's important here is not who was right first, but what happens when both perspectives meet. When science describes the how and spirituality points to the what, a fuller picture emerges. One grounded in evidence, the other grounded in experience. The problem is that much of this knowledge remains fragmented. Science often keeps its findings in academic language, removed from daily life. Spirituality sometimes keeps its insights in symbolic language, removed from practical application. And so people miss the bridge between them. That bridge is attention. Both domains agree on one thing. Whatever you consistently attend to becomes more real to you. Not because it is the only thing that exists, but because it is the thing you are training yourself to notice and respond to. Over time, that training shapes perception, behavior, and outcomes. This is not about blind belief or positive thinking. Science has shown that forced optimism can backfire. Spiritual traditions also warned against false positivity. The emphasis was never on pretending everything is fine. It was on seeing clearly without distortion. Clarity is the common ground. When attention is fragmented, reality feels overwhelming. When attention is steady, complexity becomes navigable. When attention is hijacked by fear, the world feels hostile. When attention is grounded, the same world feels workable. Neither science nor spirituality claims that attention controls everything. What they both reveal is more subtle. Attention conditions experience. This conditioning happens whether you are aware of it or not. The difference is agency. When attention is unconscious, patterns run you. When attention becomes conscious, you begin to work with those patterns instead of being driven by them. Ancient practices like meditation were not about escaping reality. They were about refining observation, slowing it down, making it less reactive. Modern neuroscience now confirms that these practices change brain function, emotional regulation, and perception. Again, the language differs, but the insight is the same. The mind that learns to observe without immediately reacting becomes more coherent. Decisions improve, stress responses soften. The world does not magically transform, but it becomes less chaotic because the observer is less chaotic. This convergence is not an accident, it's a correction. For centuries, science tried to remove the observer to remain objective. Spirituality tried to understand the observer to reduce suffering. Both approaches reached a limit. Now they are circling back toward the same realization. The observer cannot be excluded. And yet knowing this intellectually changes very little. You can understand neuroplasticity and still live on autopilot. You can admire ancient wisdom and still allow your attention to be constantly pulled by noise. Knowledge does not equal integration. Integration happens when you notice how easily your attention is influenced, how quickly it is pulled outward, how often it is shaped by sources that have no stake in your well-being. This is where the next quiet problem appears. Even when the mind is capable of fine-tuning, something else is often holding the dial. Not fate, not biology, other people's signals, constantly entering through your observation and slowly programming what feels normal, important, or real. One of the most influential decisions you make each day is not a decision at all. It's what you allow into your attention. Most of the time, this happens silently, without debate, without consent. Signals enter, stories repeat, emotions are suggested, and slowly, the dial of your mind is adjusted by hands you never see. This is the silent mistake. You may believe your thoughts are your own, but much of what feels like thinking is actually reacting to information that was planted moments, hours, or years ago. News headlines framed to provoke fear. Opinions repeated often enough to feel like facts. Images designed to trigger comparison. None of this needs to persuade you consciously. It only needs your attention. Attention is the gateway. Once something passes through it, it begins to influence perception. The mind learns through exposure. What you see repeatedly becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes acceptable. What is acceptable becomes normal. This process doesn't require agreement. It runs on repetition. And because it's gradual, it rarely feels invasive. You don't notice your attention being trained. You notice the result and assume it's natural. Over time, this training shapes what you expect from the world, what you fear, what you desire, what you believe is possible or impossible. You begin to react to reality based on a script you didn't write. This is not about manipulation in a dramatic sense. It's about default settings. When you don't consciously tune your attention, it tunes itself to whatever signal is loudest and most frequent. And in a world saturated with information, the loudest signals are rarely the most nourishing. The nervous system responds before reason has a chance. A headline spikes anxiety. A comparison image triggers inadequacy. A repeated narrative hardens into belief. By the time you notice how you feel, the signal has already done its work. This is why so much influence is invisible. It doesn't tell you what to think. It tells you what to notice. And what you notice becomes your reality. The danger is not that others have perspectives. The danger is that their perspectives quietly replace your capacity to observe for yourself. You stop asking, what is actually happening here? And start reacting to pre-packaged interpretations. When this happens long enough, inner authority erodes. You lose trust in your own perception. You look outward for cues on how to feel, what to value, what to fear. The mind becomes reactive rather than responsive. This is especially subtle because it often feels like staying informed, staying connected, staying aware. But awareness without discernment is not awareness. It is exposure. A well-tuned mind chooses its input carefully, not out of avoidance, but out of respect for its own sensitivity. Just as you wouldn't pour random substances into a delicate instrument, a mind that understands its influence becomes selective about what it consumes. When that selectivity is absent, emotional states begin to fluctuate wildly. One moment you feel hopeful, the next, overwhelmed. One day the future seems open, the next, it feels closed. These shifts often have little to do with personal experience and everything to do with borrowed signals. And yet, because the signals arrive through your own senses, they feel personal. The reaction feels like yours. The fear feels justified. The urgency feels real. This is how programming works. Not through force, but through familiarity. Over time, this borrowed mental environment shapes how you observe reality itself. You begin to look through layers of interpretation that are not yours. The world feels harsher, faster, more divided than it actually is. Your attention is pulled outward, away from direct experience and into constant commentary. This constant commentary fragments observation. You stop seeing clearly. You see through noise, and when observation is noisy, reality feels unstable. You feel pulled in too many directions, decisions become reactive, clarity feels rare. The problem is not a lack of intelligence or willpower, it is a lack of quiet. To reclaim your mind is not to withdraw from the world. It is to re-establish authorship over your attention, to notice when your emotional state is being shaped by something you didn't choose, to pause before accepting an interpretation as truth. This pause is powerful because it interrupts automatic tuning. It creates space for observation instead of reaction. Without that pause, it becomes easy to forget something essential. Your mind is not meant to be a container for everyone else's fears, opinions, and projections. It is meant to be an instrument of perception, capable of clarity, depth, and discernment. And when that instrument is constantly being adjusted from the outside, it loses coherence. Reality begins to feel fragmented, confusing, even overwhelming. At that point, a deeper question quietly emerges, not about information or influence, but about where reality actually begins, and whether what you call the world is something you are living in, or something that is living through you. There is a moment when the usual way of thinking quietly collapses. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for a question to appear that refuses to go away. What if you're not inside reality, moving through it as an isolated point? What if reality is moving through you? At first, this idea feels wrong, almost backwards. You have spent your entire life identifying as the one who experiences, the one who thinks, the one who observes. Reality in that story is something external that you encounter. But when you look closely at your actual experience, this separation starts to feel less solid. Everything you know about the world arrives through you. Sound enters your ears, light enters your eyes, sensations register in your body, thoughts arise in awareness. There is no experience of reality that exists for you outside of this process. Reality, as you know it, is always happening within perception. This doesn't mean the world isn't real. It means that your experience of it is inseparable from the way it moves through your nervous system. You don't live outside reality and step into it occasionally. You are immersed in it continuously, breathing it, interpreting it, responding to it. Reality expresses itself through sensation, emotion, thought, and reaction inside you. In that sense, it is not something you visit. It is something that inhabits you. This is the logical break. If reality only becomes meaningful as it is perceived, then perception is not a side effect, it is a central event. And if perception is central, then the observer is not peripheral. The observer is a meeting point. This shifts the question from what am I experiencing to how is reality expressing itself through this experience right now. When this shift happens, something subtle but profound changes. You stop feeling like a small self navigating a massive world. You begin to feel like a process within a larger movement, not in a poetic sense, but in a practical one. Your emotions are no longer just personal flaws or achievements. They are signals, information about how reality is currently being interpreted and metabolized. Your thoughts are not commands. They are patterns arising within awareness, shaped by history, context, and attention. This perspective doesn't remove responsibility. It refines it. If reality is living through you, then the quality of your awareness matters. Not because you control the universe, but because you are one of the places where the universe becomes conscious of itself. How clearly that happens depends on how distorted or coherent your observation is. When awareness is cluttered by fear, borrowed narratives, and automatic thinking, reality expresses itself as confusion and friction. When awareness is grounded, open, and present, reality expresses itself as order and flow. The external conditions may be the same. The expression is different. This is why trying to dominate reality feels exhausting. You are trying to control something you are already part of. It's like a wave trying to command the ocean. The effort creates tension because it is based on a false premise of separation. When that premise dissolves, effort changes into participation. You don't force outcomes. You influence trajectories through the quality of your engagement. Your attention becomes less about control and more about alignment. You listen more. You sense timing. You respond rather than impose. From this perspective, many struggles take on a different tone. Resistance often comes from misunderstanding your role. You push when you could adjust. You brace when you could observe. You fight signals instead of reading them. Reality is constantly communicating, through sensation, through emotion, through patterns that repeat until they are noticed. When you treat these as obstacles instead of messages, the communication grows louder, not as punishment, but as persistence. Seeing yourself as a place where reality lives softens the sense of isolation. You are no longer carrying everything alone. You are participating in something larger that is moving, adapting, and learning through countless forms, including yours. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you attentive. Attention, in this view, is not something you do to reality. It is how reality becomes articulated within you. The clearer the attention, the clearer the articulation. And when attention is clear, something else becomes obvious. What you call your life is not a fixed path you walk along. It is a dynamic interaction between inner state and outer condition, continuously shaping and reshaping itself. This is where the sense of control gives way to a different kind of agency. You may not decide everything that happens, but you deeply influence how it unfolds by the way you receive it, by the openness or resistance you bring, by the stories you repeat or release. Once this logical break occurs, the old question of how do I make reality do what I want loses its grip. A quieter question takes its place, one that feels more honest and more powerful. How am I participating in what is already happening, and what would it mean to participate with clarity instead of habit? That question doesn't seek an answer in thought alone. It invites a shift in observation itself. You are not a spectator of your life. You are the transmitter. Every moment, something is being sent through you. Your attention, your emotional tone, the way you meet what is happening. Reality doesn't wait for your words. It responds to your state. Not because the universe is judging you, but because it is listening to how you are tuned right now. The true awakening is not about forcing better thoughts or escaping the world. It's realizing that your way of observing is already shaping what comes next. When awareness becomes clear, life stops feeling random. You begin to sense rhythm instead of chaos, direction instead of noise. Nothing mystical, just participation instead of autopilot. If this reached you, write this sentence in the comments: I am adjusting the signal. That's how I'll know you stayed until the end. And if this connected with you and you want to go deeper, choose one of the videos on the screen now. It's there for a reason.